Very much indeed, Claire. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all back. We have an hour and a quarter, and we're going to split it into 40 minutes or so of responses from our four panelists, whom I will introduce in a minute, and then we will have a 30-minute Q&A towards the end. So a few introductory comments just to frame what we're going to do. I'm the head of Girls' Education Department at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office here in the UK. We know that research and evidence are only useful if they inform and change the way decision-making is taken on policies and delivery for governments, for donors, for CSOs, for researchers themselves. And it cannot be used exclusively by those not actually running countries. Otherwise, it doesn't really land where it needs to. And I think we know that for long-term system change, governments will need to accept and own the data, evidence, and recommendations. And we will all have seen instances where good research is actually rejected by those governments because it comes from another country and assumptions have been made about its transferability, or it's too at odds with the current cultural or political imperatives at work within that country. So I would say never ignore the politics. And we heard this morning about globally informed but locally led, and I think we probably need to shift nearer to locally informed and locally led, but that is a journey we're on. It can also be as simple as just not providing evidence in an accessible or easily digestible format for government stakeholders. I'm sure we've all seen that happen. They're busy people. So what we're looking at this afternoon is the ecosystem of evidence for governments to maximise uptake and buy-in. We've got four fabulous panelists here whom I'm going to introduce, and I expect many of you know them already. To my left here, we have Pauline Rose, who is Professor of International Education at the University of Cambridge, where she is the Director of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Centre in the Faculty of Education. Next to Pauline, we have Dhir Jhingran, who is the founder and executive director at the Language and Learning Foundation. And this is a non-profit focused on improving student foundational learning at scale. Thank you for joining us. Beyond Dhir, we've got Armando Ali, who is the chief executive officer at the PAL network, where he provides overall leadership, a sense of collective ownership, and belonging within that network, ensuring sustained growth, health, and impact. And then finally, we have Maroof Syed, who is the president and CEO of the Centre for Economic Research in Pakistan, with over 25 years of entrepreneurship, investment, and leadership experience. If they want to say anything more about what they've been doing, obviously they can do that once they've got started. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions for them. They have prepped their questions. They're going to stick strictly to time, so we have no concerns on that front. I'm going to turn to Pauline first. Could you share a specific example of a time when you saw governments use evidence and what you learned from that?
Great, thank you. I think this is a sort of question that's thread through the conference and is really important for all the work that we're doing. There are a few different examples I could think of that we've been working with the Girls' Education Challenge, the work that we've been doing with Rise Ethiopia, but the one I'm going to focus on is on CamFed. I'm not sure if Catherine is in the room here. Oh, we got 2 people from CamFed. So they can speak more about what CamFed does than I campaign for female education, for those that don't know. CamFed works in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, supporting girls' education. I mean, it does far more than that, so I'm just giving a very brief within my 5-minute summary. And what I'm going to focus on is their Learner Guide program, which is a peer mentor program, where girls and young women who have graduated from the support that they were provided by CamFed through bursaries, through the pedagogical support within schools, which benefits both girls and boys, and they have graduated from the program, and then they become peer mentors themselves and provide support to girls who are now in school with life skill support and other things. Now, this program, I think the sort of lessons from this is, first of all, CamFed works very directly with government from the very outset of designing the program. It's not that CamFed says, okay, here's what we want to do, now you adopt it. It's got ideas of things that have worked in other related contexts that might not work in Tanzania, for example, that did work in Zimbabwe, but very much a dialogue from that outset. And also importantly, for somebody like me, is engaging with research and evidence from the very outset, not thinking, oh, down the road, actually, it would be quite nice to have a study on this. From the very outset, thinking about what we want to learn and sort of seeing that as part of the journey. So that complementarity of the engagement with government and the rigorous evidence throughout has been really important. So from quite an early stage, and this work has been funded by FCDO and many other funders as well, private foundations and so on, it's found that from these impact evaluations, there have been found to be positive results. And these positive results have been both for girls as well as for boys. So based on those positive results and that evidence that has been very much engaged with government, has then more recently been a discussion, I mean, not it's been ongoing discussion, but more recently actually activating it, of saying about the uptake and scaling up of the program through government. So saying CAMFED's taking a step back. CAMFED doesn't need to exist necessarily for this program to continue, and perhaps shouldn't exist. And what happened at this stage was that there was a process of government, CAMFED, and us in the Real Centre, together with researchers in the University of Dar es Salaam, coming together and having a process for this scaling up, a process which included research and evidence, that included governments observing the program and us sort of observing the government observing the program and documenting all of this process. And a dialogue that was also enriched through the research and evidence process of what the government felt it could adopt, couldn't adopt, why not, how it needed to change. And this then has enabled, facilitated a very constructive approach to sort of uptake and scaling up, and I think has been really effective. So there's both the sort of what one would see as the more quantitative impact of evidence, but also the more process evaluation research side of the evidence. So just a couple of lessons from this, which I think we all know, and I think came up yesterday in some of the discussion, the absolute need for alignment from the outset. We were all aligned in the importance of really strengthening opportunities for girls in secondary school, and these are the CAMFED works through the government secondary schools and really supporting them, but supporting the wider education ecosystem at the same time. Really important about the relationship building and trust. That takes time. There will be disagreements, but if you have that relationship and you have that trust, you can have those disagreements and you can come to a way that you can find a convergence and you can openly air those disagreements or those challenges that you're facing. And the third one is about patience. As researchers, we're often wanting to just get on and collect data and get the outcomes, but actually, people in government are extremely busy. There's a need to sort of speak and to be respectful of time and also of really engaging and thinking and internalizing the sort of issues that they face and that are real for them. So those are my three takeaways.
Thank you very much indeed, Pauline. Moving on to Dhir, I know that you work closely with governments in your work to encourage the use of evidence. Can you talk us through a little bit about what you've seen work and then particularly what hasn't worked?
Right, thank you. The first point that I want to make about evidence uptake in the education ecosystem, especially the government, is that good, really useful evidence in Indian context is scant. And most evidence is today being generated in the form of impact evaluations, which is sort of end of the program cycle. They just say, focus mainly on attributing impact to a program and say difference in difference, 2.5 times the original target. What often is missing is what therefore is to learn from there. And however, there are recent trends in India about evaluations, including teaching and learning processes, mentoring support, and teacher perceptions, etc., which is a good trend. And Impact Bond Lifted, which was presented on the 24th, actually includes system strengthening indicators. So there's more about what's happening in the system rather than at the end coming up with a final result. One of the big needs in India is research around implementation and governance, because that's where the biggest problems are, and there's not enough of that. Second point I want to make is that governments often do not seem to engage with evidence, as you mentioned, and I was speaking with Professor Sonali Nag of the University of Oxford yesterday, and she said, if you open a conversation with government by presenting evidence, there's straight away an alienation, and that's her experience. And I attribute this to several reasons. One, I think typically governments often look at, can we get evidence for something we already want to do? And we've sort of decided, and let's get people to provide evidence for that. The Indian education ecosystem is very relational. More than hard evidence, what is valued is there a buzz? Are teachers talking about it? Administrators, what's coming from the field? Are unions happy with it? And we are big beneficiaries of this. We did a development impact bond 2019 to 22, and before the results could come in, the government decided to scale it because they felt there's good vibes around it. So that's the kind of thing that happens. Also, the Indian education system, as the government system in general, is hierarchical. And it is often the top bureaucracy, the senior leadership that takes a lot of the decisions. I kind of know it. I was from that breed, then I moved away. And let me say, very opinionated. I can say I was not that type. I mean, you don't know, so maybe so that's there. But basically, therefore, for example, there was a senior leader just last week who was saying to me, you guys are too worried about pedagogy and how children learn. What's most important is that all children should come to school regularly and all teachers should come and teach. And the rest is not important. I mean, there is a view there, but then that's how, if there are strong opinions, you don't find that, evidence is, and as Judith mentioned, the last point is this, that often evidence from outside the country or even from another state, the standard response is our context is different. And then you can argue, but then you're already on the back foot. And the last point I want to make is that evidence that nonprofit CSOs present is often unintelligible. Again, I think you alluded to that. We present 100 columns in the evaluation results and box plots, and it's important to demystify, use simpler language, and even go for local languages. I want to end on a slightly positive note. There is a silver lining. And I think there are two things. One, that CSOs are using a lot of evidence from across the world. In India, there are networks of CSOs. For early learning, there are 2 networks. We're using a lot of evidence. Progressive funders, for example, do a lot of learning exchange programs where evidence from across the world is being used. And we are sort of taking positions based on that. And the last one is that a lot of data is being generated within the government ecosystem through classroom observations and formative student assessments, which is owned by the government. It's not being used yet, but I think there's great potential because there's ownership of that data, and there's great potential to use that for evidence-based decision-making.
Thank you very much indeed. Moving on to Armando, I'm going to ask you a similar question. I said I was going to do Maroof next, but let's just stay this order. Is that okay, Maroof? Yeah. So you also work with governments, and we're going to look at the same issues to encourage evidence use. What works, what hasn't worked in your experience?
Thank you. 20 years ago, Brookman here and her peers, they created a very simple tool to assess literacy and numeracy, just to see if children can read and do basic math. And she mobilized a group of people in India, and they went to from household to household, just to see if children could read a very simple grade 2 story. That process then was taken over in many other countries, in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in what we are calling now a movement of citizen-led assessment people. That's the organization that I represent, and I wanted to give this story just to make my points much more clear. So it started as a process to find out if children can read, maybe to encourage some actions at the local level, but it rapidly became a tool of social accountability and interaction with governments. And the question that we were asking at time, which we are asking today, 20 years later, is very simple. Are our children learning? And evidence from those processes run in different countries were showing that many children were going to school, but they were not learning. So you can imagine that we were in the early 2000s, where everyone were focused on building more schools, getting more teachers trained, and getting more children into the schools. And these people here, they started asking, but are they learning? So 2 years ago, I met a senior official from the Ministry of Education in Kenya. And when I was introducing myself, what the PAL network is, and I explained what we do, and she said, oh, you are from those people from Uwezo. I said, yes. And she said, these people, when they launched their first report in 2010, we had a crisis meeting in the Ministry of Education. Because suddenly, a group of people are coming here to call us, to tell us that children are going to school and they are not learning. No one was ready to hear that. And we had a crisis meeting in the Ministry of Education in Kenya. So after very heavy discussions, we had a list of 20 questions to ask those people in the next day. And someone within the meeting said, but what if they are right? What if what they are saying is correct? So we decided silently to also do a similar survey to see if what they are saying is correct. And that's how, from that survey, that's how we started maybe thinking about the CBC that we have today. That was something that came from the insiders, how they started also looking for other ways to figure out if what we are saying is true or not. It's not written anywhere. Maybe it will not, we will not find it written anywhere, but we are happy to see that the movement started there, and the idea of also looking to other lens to see the situation was also encouraged. So from our collective experience at PAL Network, I think there are 3 or 4 things that we did to somehow influence governments to listen to evidence. One was to be persistent, to continuously producing evidence and publishing. Persistence seems to be very easy, but sometimes requires also some level of courage. 2 was to keep the message very simple. The way we communicate our findings should be understandable, not just for the government, but for the population as well. Anyone should be able to understand what we are saying. The third one was also to use very simple tools that can easily be administered by anyone, and it can easily also help one to see what are the results saying. And fourth, I think Rukmini mentioned yesterday when she was talking about interventions, that one should go to a teaching process for at least 3 weeks to be able to run learning camps. So engaging government officials and asking them to come with us and going to the field for them also to assess children using those tools was very eye-opening. We call it do-it-yourself strategy. So those are the issues that I think were helpful for us.
Thank you very much indeed. Admirably keeping to time, everybody. Maroof, sorry for turning the order around. What role do you think external partners to government can most usefully play in building a more robust ecosystem around evidence use?
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's been really exciting, and especially exciting to see the sun this morning. You know, I like to think of the role that external partners can have in 3 distinct ways. One is really, you know, Tahir talked about yesterday, we always take a systems view. So mapping the ecosystem is really, really key because a lot of times there are overlapping mandates in government departments. There's a lot of work or initiatives that are happening in silos. And sometimes, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. So, mapping that ecosystem helps identify these actors across the system, but also their frictions, their incentives. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, some more. But and then the second part is to really thinking around being an honest broker. So as I said, there are a lot of overlapping mandates, and in the Pakistani context, given the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, education is a provincial matter, right? But a lot of international aid comes through the federal government. So there is a lot of coordination failures that emerge between the federal government and the provincial government. So being an honest broker is a very important role that an external partner can play in ensuring that this work in silos, completely disconnected from one another, can actually inform things across the system. And one of the points that my colleagues made was around, I call it post-belief rationalization, right? You want to do something, and then you just basically rationalize it. So I think the third very important role that external partners can play is offering complementary services. So in SERV's case, we have 6 units. We have about 400 people across these 6 units now over the last few years. And one of them is research. But the other aspects that we engage with the government are complementary. So an example would be our program around building capacity to use research evidence. Here we have, over the last 10 years, trained about 5,000 to 6,000 bureaucrats in the system. And oftentimes when these transfers happen, a new secretary will say, oh, I took BCure, 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And that instantly establishes a sense of relationship, a sense of trust. And this BCure program has been, around for a long time. So it's a very, very well-recognized entity within the Pakistan Administrative Services. And the other 2 pieces that I'll include are analytics, right? So a lot of, this is not a research intervention. This is more about supporting the government in a technical advisory capacity to really push that thinking that data is not your enemy, right? And the third, the last one is really, we have embedded people in the Ministry of Planning and Development, where we're really pushing this thinking around, evaluation ex ante rather than ex post. One of my colleagues said that it's after the fact that you're doing this kind of learning. So really pushing this through across, not just the Ministry of Education, but rather across the system.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all hear me. I seem to have been remiked. Shout if you can't. That's great. We've set the scene there. We've got some good evidence. We've got some specificity around different countries, different governance, different ways of working. We'll come back to Pauline now. How do you think an implementation science approach can facilitate government use of evidence, therefore? And in particular, this may not come as a surprise, from a gender and social inclusion perspective.
Yeah, and on reflection from the sort of framing for that question, I'm going to actually start at the end of that question and start with a gender and social inclusion perspective, because I've been reflecting a lot over the last 2 days and listening to the presentations. Some of you will have heard I asked a question to the first panel about what those that have got programs as part of What Works Hub are doing in relation to gender and social inclusion. And I think we've collectively probably got a lot more to learn and to think about in terms of how we bring implementation science research together with a gender and social inclusion perspective. So there's probably work going on here of thinking about implementation science research, and there's work going on here about gender and social inclusion, and I'm not sure we're seeing them coming together sufficiently at the moment. I should say, position myself, I have a bit of a responsibility on this, as I'm the Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor of the What Works Hub Global Education. So I feel like I'm sort of in the firing line, if that's the right term. But so I'm doing this work together with my colleague here, Dr. Laura Niaz, who has been helping and thinking through some of these issues. So we were thinking, I mean, it may be sort of seem like this is obvious, but thought it might be worth just starting by saying, what do we mean by a gender and social inclusion perspective? Is this obvious to us all or not? Because I think often we're thinking about it in terms of maybe disaggregating data, or maybe thinking, oh, we've got this disaggregated data, now let's see what the outcomes are. But taking a step back from that, I think it's actually really a lot more than that. So we were looking, and there's a very helpful how-to note from FCDO on gender and social inclusion, which includes a definition that's taken from elsewhere. So I'm going to just read it, and they've got a slightly different terminology, but gender equality, disability, and social inclusion is a concept that examines unequal power relations between different social groups. The approach focuses on the need for action to rebalance these power relations and ensure equal rights, opportunities, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their social identity. Now, I feel we probably haven't been hearing enough about power imbalances and rebalancing power imbalances. There was a little bit of discussion in the last session about power relations in relation to teachers, which I thought was really refreshing to hear, and putting the sort of giving teachers more of a voice and so on, but I don't feel that we've been hearing enough about this more generally, whether this is, and when we're talking about this, by the way, I know we often think about girls versus boys, but again, it needs to go far beyond that. It needs to look at intersecting disadvantages and forms of potential identity, gender, wealth, race, disability, geography, language. It's going to vary according to different contexts. We've also been reviewing the evidence. We've still got more way to go, so we'd welcome if anyone's got evidence on implementation science that does include a gender and social inclusion lens, please do send it our way. We started by looking at what works have been collating more generally on implementation science, and reviewed in relation to education, reviewed that it's almost absent other than maybe a little bit of disaggregated data. So in a sense, this is an opportunity for the What Works Hub. It's something that we can be seeing as groundbreaking. We can do things differently, but it does need us to also think about things differently. There is more in health, and it might be partly, to be honest, this term implementation science being taken from health. So there's probably a lot more work. So the CAMFED example I gave earlier, perhaps that would be implementation science, but we haven't been using the term. And there's probably a lot more examples like that. So maybe we just need to sort of broaden the net a bit of what we're including. Isn't necessarily tagged with that term as it currently stands. I'm just going to end. There's a World Health Organization framework for health work, recognizing that they also weren't doing much on gender and social inclusion. They've developed a framework, and we've adapted this, and it's a framework that others will have seen elsewhere, and it relates to some work that Manaza had also been doing with FCDO that we adapted. And I'm going to provide the sort of scoring, and I'm going to leave you to think about where you think your work fits, whether you're an implementer, whether you're a researcher, and how you can move from one point on the scale to higher on the scale. So -1, I don't think anyone in this room is on -1, but let me just put it out there, that gender and social inclusion is about unequal research implementation, that it reinforces and potentially exacerbates gender and social inclusion inequality. A 0 is if you've just totally admitted it, ignores gender and social inclusion within the design of the work, within the conceptualization, processes, and outcomes. So it's just admitting even thinking about it. Global and social inclusion aware, so you're aware of it. You might be disaggregating your data. You might be collecting data, be sort of aware, and you want to collect data on maybe disaggregated by sex. So we heard some on disability yesterday, and at least aware of the importance of that. So that's a 1, you'd score a 1 for that. A 2, you're going to get, if you're gender sensitive, you're recognizing it in the design and you take actions, but perhaps without actually thinking about changing power dynamics. And then 3, if you've scored a 3, you're getting there, gender transformative, where your gender and social inclusion approach is central to your design, and you aim to explicitly transform harmful gender and social inclusion norms, and you foster progressive power relationships. So I'll leave it there, and I won't ask you all to say where you think you fit, but we can happy to have discussions about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Provocative. I hope you're scoring yourselves generously as well as harshly. Dhir, let's move on. You have mentioned in the past a large volume of monitoring data that gets generated from classroom observations by government staff in India specifically. We know it happens in other countries. What's the potential for its use for evidence-based follow-up to improve learning and teaching processes?
Right. So I think there is a lot of potential because this data is owned by the government. It's collected by their own people, unlike the wariness about data that's coming from evidence that's coming from other countries or other places. But as I love to begin with challenges up front, I think too much data is collected. In one state in India, I was saying the other day, 5 million data points are generated every month. And then, of course, the quality is an issue. And for several reasons. The focus is on filling in the app and for that data to be then uploaded. There's also an expectation of improvement, a sort of secular trend of improvement in teaching and learning processes and student learning. And these messages in the government sometimes become, though they are implicit, but they become very explicit. And then, of course, data and evidence starts to happen that way. And the use of evidence for governance purposes, it's happening at scale in India. So blocks and districts, which are units of educational administration, being told that, you are at so-and-so rank, and you've got to improve. So a little bit of naming and shaming there. And the end result is that in one state, almost all the districts are sitting at 90% of, let's say, an indicator like the use of teacher guide, and where do you go from there? So those are the challenges that's implicit in the way data has been collected. But I think, as I said at the beginning, there's huge potential. And I'll give you just two examples of how we are trying to work with governments for this. One is use in interaction with teachers in reflection meetings and school visits to be able to say that higher order comprehension questions of the why and how type are not being asked, whether it's an oral language class or it's during or after reading. And there is data to support that. And a conversation really happens then. Or that most of the reading class was choral repetition. Really, children weren't reading. I mean, we've also tried to use a video evidence to show how when a teacher is reading out and expecting children to be reading with her, children's fingers are in very different places, while the teacher assumes that they're actually reading with her. So, of course, such videos have to be used carefully, should not be finger pointing, but more as an exercise to point out that things are not happening the way they should. So I think the evidence at that level is really, really valuable. The second way in which we are promoting the use of data and evidence is through the block and district level review meetings that happen. Typically, they're highly administrative in nature. They discuss administrative stuff, establishment matters, but trying to include teaching and learning outcomes there. What is helping is to be able to prioritize that huge data set and say that, let's look at 5 things that we could be changing, or you could be changing, or teachers need to work on, or the teacher mentors you should focus on for the next few months. Identify that, and let's all discuss this data. What is this data showing? That focuses the discussion onto those few items rather than that huge data set that is available. This becomes a standard agenda item in every administrative meeting. It's a fixed item that must happen each time. And what's supporting this is visually appealing dashboards that can point out a limited set of indicators and where the real problem is to help move decision making. So we see huge potential. It's not happening fully yet, but I think this the classroom observation data, the formative student assessment data has huge potential to be moving the needle on improving teaching and learning.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Dhir. We're going to go back to Armando now. You suggested you'd like to speak about how we incentivize governments to adopt evidence-based decisions. Interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. I wish I knew.
Put it out there.
But yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have nowadays is incentivizing governments to adopt evidence and to use evidence. I don't know, I don't have answers, but maybe there are two things that we could explore. Most of us, we work with teachers, with head teachers, with technocrats, but those people, they are accountable to politicians. And politicians, in a normal world, they are accountable to citizens. I don't know if that is the world where we are, but ideally, they listen to what people want. So I have been asking myself, are there ways of making this a movement of demanding quality education to become a people's movement, like a demand that's coming from people, in a way that politicians can reflect that maybe this is what our people want? Is there a way of getting there, of every 5 years, whenever they are there to renew their seats, should this issue be something that they worry about in a way that can decide if they continue or not? I think that can be a good incentive to make the chain from the implementers to policymakers complete, for all of us to be accountable about the importance of quality education, and to recognize that it's not only for us, it's for our future generations. We have the responsibility of leaving this world in good hands as well. The second idea, I think it was also raised yesterday here, maybe there's a way of bringing more of those government officials in these discussions and to start building trust together. Building trust in a way that we are saying here that evidence will only help you to make the best choices, even the best use of your resources. Is there a way of start building that movement together and getting more government officials also in this space? And this is not just about building awareness about importance of evidence. It's also about connections, building trust and building networks through which tomorrow is easier to talk with other people about issues that we have discussed and agreed together. Maybe, just maybe.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting you to have all the answers. And then finally, going back to Maroof, what approaches could work in navigating the political economy of implementation and in embedding a foundational learning program?
Yeah, I think building on Armando's point around incentive alignment, right? I mean, there's a lot of action bias and reductionist thinking in the government, right? And I like to call it the uncle syndrome. How many social gatherings have you gone to, or government meetings even, where somebody starts saying that I know what the real problem of blah, blah country is? And so I think there is a lot of that. And I think when incentive alignment, I like to sort of think of it in two specific ways. One is to meet people where they're at, rather than expecting them to meet you where you're at. I think that's very crucial. Because when we lead with evidence, sometimes our expectations are that they will, understand what I'm saying, which is, usually a bad expectation to have. And then instilling a shared purpose. I think in our case, when TIP started to really get embedded in the government, this was right after COVID. And I think there was a general sense for learning losses and instilling that shared purpose that primary students are behind grade level, right? And there was some urgency right after COVID, but to really continue that, in fact, these kids are behind grade level, and what can we do together to bring them back? The second part is really, the question of sustainable scalability. and really deepening the work within the government department that you're working with, but also across different departments. And given the fact that we have a lot of transfers, typical tenure of a bureaucrat in Pakistan at the secretary level is 2 years, right? And by the time you've made them understand why evidence matters, they're ready for another post, right? And in fact, in one of the cases, the KP Secretary of Education was transferred during vacation. So, I can only sympathize. And I think, a lot of times researchers don't fully internalize bureaucratic or political constraints. I think that's something that we can do better. But embedding and deepening it with, data people at Ministry of Education, not just the secretary, the additional secretary, the joint secretary, just deepening it at multiple layers and maintaining that level of contact is crucial. And then across the system, because you never know, the planning secretary may become the education secretary. So at least in my view, that is very, very important to have. And the third, data is political and failure is costly, right? So these, bureaucrats, a lot of times, I think almost evaluation is a dirty word because it says that I'm going to judge you. Right? You're back in kindergarten, somebody is giving you a star or something. But, so we have to, we say that evaluation is really about learning, but I think a lot of times it's not viewed as such. And so to reframe it as an exercise, as a joint exercise of exploration, and yes, you're not going to have this perfect policy design in the first go, but rather an exploration to get to that, definition of success that we want. In our case, TIP has really, this remedial program, remedial education. There's a lot of demand across the system. We have NGOs like TCF coming to us. There's, the government. We just recently transferred the workbooks and a lot of material to the government, the education department. And then, of course, even edtech platforms like Taleemabad, who want to take our material, and especially the tech tool has, created a lot of buzz. But, really across the system, seeing this demand. But of course, we have concerns around implementation fidelity. So having a structure, a modality that somehow, let's call it managed implementation or something of that sort. But this sort of complementary relationship between researchers and the implementation side.
It's great. We are bang on time. I feel like I've done my job. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to throw it open to the floor now to anybody who would like to ask questions about any of these issues. I'll take, as is customary, 2 or 3 questions. If we've got them, we'll start over there with the gentleman with his hand up. Thank you. Halfway up on the left. Yep, you.
Hi, my name is Dan Wagner from the University of Pennsylvania. It's a terrific panel. Thank you very much for the diverse perspectives on these issues. I know that actually, I think everyone mentioned issues around equity or learning equity and FLN. And yet I'm reminded, I think, for those of you here yesterday, of Luis Benveniste's presentation saying in spite of all the work and all the World Bank work, we're still at around 70% learning poverty in low-income countries. And that leads us, I guess my question is, this is a panel around implementation science and government perspectives. And I think it's probably true that every government, you can correct me if I'm wrong, has part of its mission statement to help everybody and to focus on the poor. And yet, the results, in spite of all of the efforts of everybody in this room and in lots of other rooms, are really lacking. And I'm wondering if the What Works Hub needs to set as part of its agenda the issue of equity as a central feature, because you don't have to look at those issues. I think Armando put it rather well. Everybody really spoke to this. But I'm wondering if, we can get attracted by issues of scale. Governments are also interested in issues of scale, but scale sometimes works against issues of focusing on those who are most in need. And I wonder if any of the panelists would like to comment on that dimension of the future of the hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Other questions? Thank you, gentleman there in the hat.
Thanks for the discussion. One of the things that we have seen and heard, and you mentioned about the hierarchy and power dynamics within existing government systems. And we're also aware that a lot of work that is done in the governments is by the middle tier system. It's not at the secretary level, but it's at the middle tier systems where the work actually gets done. And so, I mean, the former minister also yesterday coined this term inertia, and so what is this inertia that we are talking about at the middle level, which is actually going to, move the needle?
Thank you very much. And one more. Oh, it's all the boys. Oh, forgive me. I'll go with you and then we'll come back to Rukmini afterwards and the lady at the back, but we'll do these first three first.
Thanks. A quick one. Wayne Sandholz from Nova University in Lisbon. I take very much the point that ultimately governments are responsive to citizens, or at least that's how we hope it should be. Are you aware of evidence that voters react when learning quality increases? If not, do you believe that that's true? And what would you think it would take to produce that kind of evidence? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we've got one on equity. We've got about government incentives. We've got one about the middle level inertia, and then one about how voters actually react. I'm going to start with Dhir, because you indicated you want to speak first. Go for it.
So equity is a big issue, but I think the one point I want to say where we can start is large-scale assessments are happening in the entire system in India, baselines, midlines, the governments do them, others do them. But they're always about mean scores and are they improving? So I think a good starting point is that these assessments look at the trajectory of children who are in the lowest quartile, let's say, and how are they doing? That would be a good starting point for everyone for a call for action and alerts that, there is a problem there, even if overall mean scores are improving. So just that one point. On the middle layer, I think there are several issues, but one of them is this, that the middle tier does not feel accountable for bringing about a change in the classrooms. That is an expectation, but somewhere they're stuck in the middle about, are they doing work for the administrators? Are they really instructional leaders or not? And that change in their span of control of 30 schools, let's say, or 30 teachers, is something that is an expectation from them, has not been established. So they would go around and visit schools, do their duty, collect data, fill it up, but not take that responsibility that why is something not happening, and then decide to prioritize a few things and do that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Pauline next.
Thank you. I'm going to partly just follow up on the point that you made at the beginning about starting with looking at the lowest quartile, which I think is absolutely essential. But I think we need to also go beyond that to also look at who is it that's in this lowest quartile, why are they there, and what needs to be done to accelerate their progress so that they catch up. Because I think a lot of the discussion, and we had a lot of this debate on RISE as well, was about, okay, if we improve learning for those in general, everybody will increase. But I think we've got enough evidence to know that's not the case. So I think we really need to be pushing ourselves beyond that. A second point, I think, in relation to Dan's question is that, and what's something that we're going to be looking at as part of the work that we're doing with What Works Hub, is we know that there's potentially a trade-off between reaching the most marginalized. This is based on work that some of us in the room here have been doing also for the Girls' Education Challenge. We know it costs more. We know that it's challenging to do. And there can sometimes be a trade-off between that and saying we're going to go at scale, because we're going to go at scale, but we're still going to potentially miss that 10 to 20%. So we have to make decisions, and there's sort of moral decisions, there's different types of decisions that we need to make about where we're putting our resources. So the minister might be able to, if you go for the scale, be able to announce, we've reached millions more children. That's wonderful. That's a great political statement to make. But if we're going for reaching the most marginalized, we're not necessarily going to be able to say those big numbers. So how do we get that balance right? My third point is that obviously, and we all know this, and it links to a point that was made earlier around the political economy. We know, as somebody was saying, there's obviously a huge amount of learning poverty still, as Lewis was pointing out, and that some countries and areas are going back. So I'm just going to make one plug. We've just literally finished a report on education in Gaza in the context of the current war, and it's just devastating. So I'd invite you all to read our report, and very happy to share it.
Thank you very much indeed. Maroof, and then Armando. Yeah.
So, I think the question around inertia and the voter response and quality of education, I'll address both of them. In my experience, it's not just inertia, but rather, if you look at the career of a bureaucrat, it goes from misplaced exuberance to complete disillusionment. So I think there's a lot of people in the government, and as I was saying, I think we don't always appreciate the bureaucratic constraints or political constraints. I sometimes sympathize with their situation, and I think sometimes it's a fragmented state, right, with diffuse power and things like that. So I think in terms of inertia, it's sometimes well-meaning, but needs to be directed, right? And that's where I think the role of evidence is really important. In our case, I mean, there was a lot of, there was a big problem, COVID, learning losses, what do I do, right? But there was also embedding it into the government's own priorities, which were around foundational student learning objectives. So just giving them a path that you're at point A and you want to get to point B, there's no guarantee that we'll get to point B, but at least getting that vector right. And in terms of voter response, I think we have started to look at some work where making it salient to political actors on one end, that Pakistan just recently, the Planning Commission actually released a report that ranked districts and tehsils on the basis of quality of education, right? So does the politician respond to it? Does that, can you make it salient? So we have some work going on in Punjab in that. And in terms of then flipping it around and looking at voters and saying that, you care about a lot of other things around infrastructure and whatnot, but where does quality of education rank in terms of, preferences? So I don't have an answer to it right now, but maybe at the next conference.
And I would just add, in Pakistan, I think Tabadlab is trying to enter the importance of education into that national discourse. I may be out of date, but they've been trying to do it for a while in terms of saying you as parents should care about how much your children are learning, and that should influence the way you use your vote in order to have some of that accountability back up the chain, whether they can then influence MPs to think, I should be held accountable for this, is a conundrum in any country, I would suggest. We're going to go back to Rukmini and then to the lady at the back. I can only see, oh, there we go. Yes, right at the back afterwards. Thank you.
I think a lot of the evidence ecosystems that we've talked about here, and maybe Pauline, you hinted at it, has to do with, schooling or learning kind of data. But the cost and the finance data sometimes is very critical, because unless you get allocated for it, you can't do it. So I was just wondering if, including you, Judith, I know you're a moderator, but you should give us your comments as well on how do different departments, for example, often on data, finance people have a different view, or planning people have a different view than the line departments. And as decision makers about allocating money, where does sort of cost evidence or cost data on ecosystems play a role?
That's a very helpful question. And it's the lady in the very back row with her hand up. Thank you.
Thanks. This is Lucy Heady from ESSA. My question is first for Pauline, but I'd be interested to hear from the rest of the panel. Pauline, I was so amazed what you were saying about how little data there is in the implementation research on gender and kind of disaggregation and understanding. And I was so surprised because there's been so much emphasis on gender and raising the profile of gender in research, not least by FCDO and many of the researchers in this room. And so I'd love your reflections on why.
Thank you. Oh, we've got two more over here. Could you take the lady just behind you, right there? Yes.
Okay, thanks.
There's another.
Hi, this question's for Pauline. I'm Barbara Bruns from Center for Global Development and Georgetown. And, you know, I think the evidence shows that there's not only been tremendous progress in getting girls access to schooling, but now there's increasing evidence that girls are doing much better in school than boys. You know, achieving more years of education, outscoring them on academic tests. So how does a center like yours, you know, respond to this kind of shifting gender agenda?
Let's take the fourth one here, and then we will come back to you. Yeah, I've got you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Akshay Mangla, teacher at University of Oxford. My question is about the role of teachers' unions. Because when we talk about evidence ecosystem, bureaucracy becomes central, but then the actual evidence is often geared towards changing something about teachers' work conditions. And so I'm wondering to what extent they factor in. They're often seen as a problem, but have you found examples in your own work, anyone on the panel, where they could be part of the solution?
Great. I'm going to come to Pauline first because she's going to deal with two of them. I promise I will say something about cost effectiveness data, my favorite subject at the moment, and then I'll bring the others in and we can try and answer all the questions. Please, Pauline.
Thanks. I think the two questions are a little bit related. So maybe I'll start with Barbara's. I think, and it relates. So I think there is a lot of research more generally that disaggregates data. I think the point was more on the implementation science research and what's labeled at that at the moment. And totally agree, Barbara, that there has been a lot of progress, and that's great. I think there's a couple of things. One is that when we're looking at gender, we're obviously looking at both girls and boys. If there are situations where boys are disadvantaged, we should still be looking at that and understanding the processes that that's happening in. But when we're looking at power relations, I do wonder whether those power relations are necessarily in favor of the girls, even if they're learning more. We know that the transitions from school to work still often disadvantage girls, and that is often related to power relations, whether that's within the household, within the community, and what the schools are themselves doing to change that. So there's an awful lot, I think, there still from a gender perspective that needs to be done. And I think that's why it's so important to go beyond just the disaggregation of the data and understanding those whys and hows, as has also been said. I think in terms of Lucy's question, I think it relates a little bit actually to Daniel's presentation on the last panel, that the work that we're doing with Education Sub-Saharan Africa, that's looking at the work that researchers in Africa are doing. Again, we were quite struck about how there needs to be more research more generally that does look at issues around inequality. There is a bit more that looks at gender than there are on other forms of inequality, but there's still far more that needs to be done. And that's sort of beyond looking more specifically the implementation science research. I think when we're talking about the implementation science research, it's partly because of this labeling of work that comes under that heading and that is getting tagged with it. But there might be more out there once we dig more deeply. But the concern is that a lot of the work that is within that at best is disaggregating the data.
Thank you. Dhir, are you nodding? Go for it.
So I'd like to respond to the cost-effective one. Of course, you will have the last word.
No, not at all.
On cost, we work with several state governments on promoting the inclusion of children's home languages for initial early learning. And one of the things that's always said is that this is going to be high cost. We've worked with a particular state, several states, but this one, where in 8 languages, a bilingual instruction program has been introduced in almost half of the state. And the additional cost was 1% of the state's annual budget, which they took out of the printing budget, where they used to print materials that were of no use in those classrooms because children didn't understand those languages. So it was fairly easy to sort of substitute that. On the issue of most marginalized children, I think it's more complex because it is about beliefs and attitudes as well, about whether these children can learn, what is their home background, etc., and requires more dialogue, reflection, consultation. More than the cost, I think it is how do we work with the system on this, and more intensive professional learning communities of teachers who are more oriented towards this. There has been success in that, but not at great scale. But I think that's work that needs to be done. Costing, yes, there will be some additional requirements, but it is very important too.
Armando.
Maybe I can go back to the question of voters before also commenting on the issue about teacher unions. I haven't seen really voters reacting to issues around quality of education or quality of learning. And I haven't even seen in many of the countries where we are represented that discussion even come into the campaigns. I think the campaigns are still dominated by inputs to the system, more teachers and more classrooms, more textbooks available, and less of learning outcomes. But what I have seen is a group of villagers, after receiving the reports of the learning outcomes in that village, start questioning about what is happening and deciding to sit with the school and the school principals to see what they can do to solve the problem. What I also have seen is in some of those places where we implement catch-up programs, a teacher who said it was too much work for him to do remediation. And we had a few facilitators, and I was part of them. We have been working with the children from that teacher specifically. And after 2 months, the results of the midterm assessment came, the children were improving, and he said, I will join the next phase. What I have seen also is Anastasia, a 12 years girl in grade 4, who was unable to read not even words in grade 4. After 3 weeks of intervention, we finished a class where we were building words from syllables. And she, for the first time, she put together the word tomato, and she said, oh, elite material in Jahuani, meaning, is this the tomato that we usually use? Oh. This is how he said, yes, this is the tomato. And that day when we finished, she said, teacher, can we stay after the class for me to learn more words? Those are the changes that evidence can show. And I think if we manage to take them to the level of policies and policy influence, maybe someone will also feel that change can happen. Now, back to the issue of teacher unions, I think teacher unions, at least in the places where we work, are some of the people who are interested in the results of learning outcomes, because they are very interested also to justify why children are not learning. If you ask many teachers, they will always say that it's related with the condition that they have. They look forward to see this evidence to demand for better qualities of inputs to the system as well.
Thank you. Maroof.
Yeah, I wanted to just add one point on gender. And Judith, you mentioned that there's been a lot of campaigns in terms of, sort of public discourse around education. And I think a lot of times, I mean, we're talking about evidence inputs into government and, but there is actually a lot of need for sharing and interventions of evidence towards media or advocacy firms, because what happened in the public discourse, the focus is so much on out of school children that it dominates. And rather than talking about what's happening in Pakistan around gender, it's fascinating. I mean, Tahir alluded to it, that, we're seeing 4x learning outcomes. I mean, we've been studying, especially in Punjab, the LEAPS program has been tracking these kids for 20 plus years. And we're seeing this massive learning outcomes for women, girls as opposed to boys. Now, that doesn't say that's true for all of Pakistan, right? I mean, in Punjab, a typical village has 7 to 8 low-cost private schools, has government schools, and all sorts of stuff. But in Sindh or Balochistan, it's very different. So there's a lot of regional heterogeneity. But at times, very superficial things get captured in the media, and that becomes the public discourse. So I feel that we really need to not only show evidence around learning outcomes for girls, but also really interventions of evidence towards media and journalists.
Thank you. And I'm just going to say a word on cost effectiveness, and then I'll come back to you. And I've got a couple of online questions, so that will then be that. Cost effectiveness data and analysis are becoming increasingly important for our ministers, certainly in FCDO, and indeed the top of the bureaucratic shop, so to speak. We know ODA is falling short. That's one problem. But there's also a sense that there has been huge investment in education, and the question as to whether we've seen sufficient progress for the investment. We have to know what works and how much different interventions through different channels, multilateral, CSOs, UN agencies, other implementers, cost, because ministers want that analysis in order to take decisions with a limited amount of funding. And the World Bank put out that, well, we know this $97 billion annual shortfall up to SDG 4. 61% of that is reckoned to have to come from governments themselves, not our government, governments funding their own education systems, 36% households, you know what that entails, and only 3% comes from external funding. So that 3% has to deliver a real multiplier effect for it to have the level of impact that we want it to have. But as we know, you buy shoes from M&S and you buy shoes from, I don't know, some fancy schmancy Bond Street store. It depends how many times you wear them, whether you like them, whether you get complimented on them, how long they last, whether it actually provides cost effectiveness. So being told that something costs $10, therefore is good value for money, is actually a waste of time, isn't it? Because that doesn't really tell us anything. And this multidimensional exclusion is where we're focused much more now in terms of how do you add the value from an equity and equality angle for those children that are girls in a rural area with a disability. Maybe they've ended up there because they're displaced due to conflict or climate change. Maybe they live in a family where child marriage is actually a good economic decision. And if you can overcome all of that, that is a very different prospect. But how do you put the cost value onto that? So we're doing an enormous amount of work, and we would welcome all contributions for how we decide with our ODA, how we influence the Global Partnership for Education, UNICEF, Education Cannot Work in Crises, in terms of where do we derive the best return from a moral angle, forgive me, from a human capacity angle. I know some people don't like that, but that's where we need to be building the evidence base in order that our ministers will really listen and take the best informed decisions. Please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sahar. I'm the Strategic Education Advisor for M&E and Research at VVOB in the South Africa office. So my question is going to link pretty much all the presentations that we've seen over the last few days that we've heard, and as well as the panel discussion. So my question really is, what does a systems approach mean or look like in the fostering of a symbiotic relationship between research, monitoring and evaluation to inform pre-design, design, implementation, impact and scaling, so that learning across the value chain of data becomes usable and meaningful for the different stakeholders? And I say this because I work in the nexus of policy, research, cost-effective studies, as well as M&E, and I see that different points in an implementation cycle, in a funding cycle, becomes relevant to different people. So how...
catch all of that.
Yeah.
Use Armando's words, I don't have all the answers.
Let's give them a go at it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
What a great question. But I've also got two online and it would be unfair to ignore them. There's a question for Dhir. As researchers, we look at evidence generation as a process to expand the menu of policy choices available for the decision maker. Is that reflective of how policy decisions are made? And then another question from somebody who's either in Pakistan or is here, but listening in from Pakistan possibly. How do we deal with the perception sometimes found in government that studies and research take too much time and it's more important to just go ahead and act? So 3 questions that you can all have a go at. Who would like to start? Maroof, good, thank you.
You know, so I think definitely, I mean, you know, we have to recognize that the research cycle and policy cycle can be very different, right? And as I was saying earlier as well, there is definitely a tendency for action, whether that action is well thought out or employs evidence. Those are, you know, secondary considerations sometimes. But I think that's why I was talking about complementary services, right? It's not always that researchers, and it really goes down to, you know, researchers also have those certain incentives that prevent them from, you know, really engaging in the policy cycle always, right? And so I think having a set of complementary services is really important to be able to, and I think this addresses the other question as well, which is that the government has many, many needs, right? On one side, the Planning Commission or the Ministry of Planning might be looking for, you know, monitoring and evaluation systems and strengthening those that cut across, you know, a vast range of projects. But also, you know, really thinking about the policy cycle. I think we learned that through the COVID experience and working on education and health intersectionality that, you know, we just didn't have the time to say, oh, I'll get to this answer in 5 years, right? So I think responding in different ways and having those engagement points is really important.
Thank you very much. The clock's there, so we'll just have to work with it. Dhir, I'm going to come to you next because you had a specific question.
Right. So I think it is important to engage at the policy level. There, I think there's greater openness to learning from what's happening around the world, let's say. And when I say policy, let's say, I'm talking about when a national policy is made or the national curriculum framework is prepared, there's greater understanding. And it's our duty to be able to put a lot of choices and options there. But often policy is broad. For example, the national education policy in India says children's home languages should be used in a formal way at the foundational stage. After that really is, what are the options? You've got 1,000 languages. What is exactly to be done? And that is where, at the level of states and regions, that if you can come up with options of what might work based on local contexts and local situations and suggest strategies for operationalizing that broad policy, that's where I think the options become very important and there's good uptake on that.
Thank you. Pauline?
Yep, just very quickly on the 2 questions. So I'll take the one first on the taking too much time. I think that's a really important point. And I was also thinking of COVID. As researchers, we somehow all managed to be able to get things out quickly to policymakers. Why can't we still do it? And I put the onus partly on the researchers. I would also put it on the policymakers and the funders, because also there's a lot more agility about getting funding to the researchers to allow us to do things quickly. And I'm not sure why we've all now gone back to our old ways of working, unfortunately. So how can we actually learn from that agility that we had all round? I'm not going to try and answer all of your question, but all I would say is that gender and social inclusion needs to be thought of at every point in that process, design of implementation and the research, the process of it, the outcomes of it, the feedback loop, and so on. So that's my input into it.
Excellent. 28 seconds. No pressure.
Thank you. Maroof and Pauline have responded to questions that I wanted to respond, but I will use my 30 seconds to also leave another homework. I had no leaving homework here. So my homework is around communication and making sense of all these numbers and evidence we produce. Could we come with very simple explanation of to politicians or teachers or whoever about standard deviation next conference? Thank you.
And he's left me with 21 seconds. You stopped it? Okay, that's very nice of you. SDG 4 is about lifelong learning, isn't it? And I think the more we can encourage, I'm not going to try and sum up, you're all smart people, you'll have taken from this what you needed to, but if we can encourage that culture of openness without fear from data that maybe doesn't suit what we want it to deliver, or evidence that doesn't reinforce what our optimism biases or our set ideas are about, I think we can help enormously with this power imbalance, who's got positional power, who doesn't want to be challenged about changing policies, about changing systems of delivery. We're all here to learn. Nobody's saying, I've got all the answers, listen to me. And I think just opening things out with governments so that that ecosystem is open to learning from people who are trying to help after all. If the evidence and research are rigorous enough, we need people to be open to that offer. Thank you very much indeed to all my panelists. Thank you to everybody for the questions. It was an enjoyable hour and a quarter. Thank you.